Hey guys, back here with another video. This time I'm going to talk about the basics of exposure and understanding light and how the various exposure modes work on your camera. So to understand that, they oftentimes refer to what they call an exposure triangle. And pretty much on each side of the triangle you have one side is the shutter, the other side is the aperture, and then the third side would be the ISO. And all three work in conjunction to create proper exposure. And what proper exposure basically means that the camera averages out a scene to an 80% gray. So basically the shutter equals the duration of time the sensor is exposed to light entering the camera. Aperture equals the amount of light exposed to the sensor. And ISO equals the adjustable sensitivity to light exposing the sensor. So basically shutter controls how much movement is rendered in a scene. So if either you blur it or you freeze it. Aperture controls the actual amount of light, which controls the depth of field, which is basically the range of sharpness from near to far, within your focal range there, captured on a scene. And then your ISO is determined how much light is allowed to be captured by the sensor by adjusting the ISO sensitivity, or the gain, per se. So shutter speed represents as whole and fraction value. So as you can see here, bulb is the shutter stays open as long as you keep your finger pressed down on the shutter button. Then the next value is 30 seconds, and then I got some other examples here, 1 second, half second, what have you. And then 1/4000th of a second, some even go up to 1/8000th, even higher using the electronic shutter. And then down here you see the various shutter speed from bulb all the way up to 1/8000th of a second. And basically you want to use a tripod or a self-timer or a shutter release cable when you're using shutter speed below 1/30th of a second to prevent blurry images due to the camera shake. So the practical applications of shutter and aperture. So for shutter settings, use a faster shutter speed to freeze motion. So for example, if you have somebody walking, you could probably use 1/125th of a second, and that'll freeze their legs in motion, provided they walk at a normal speed. If someone running, you probably want to set your shutter to 1/2000th of a second or higher, just because they're moving faster, and depending on which way they're coming at you too. If they're coming toward the camera, you could probably use a slower shutter speed, but if they're coming across the frame like this, you probably need a faster shutter speed. And then if you want to blur waterfalls, you want to use a slower shutter speed, maybe like 1 second or slower. And that's when you want to use a shutter to control the time. Now for aperture, of course, you can blur out the background. In portraits, use a larger or smaller f number, so 3.5 or larger. And then if you want to achieve sharpness from near to far, which is handy for landscape, you want to use a smaller or a larger f number, so f8 or greater. I know it's kind of confusing, so basically larger the number, smaller the opening. Smaller the number, larger the opening. So when they say a fast lens, they mean there's a smaller number, like an f2.8, f1.4, or even 1.2. So the aperture value is represented in the f numbers. They call the f-stops. So when you click your lens down in the old school, they used to have click stops on the lenses, but now it's all done by dial. So f1.2, 1.4, 1.8, all that good stuff. And some will go all the way up to f36, and some of the better lenses will go down to f1.2 or even f1.0. But generally, the common range is going to probably be, especially with like 18 to 35 kit lens, it'll be f3.5 to 5.6. And what that basically means is at 3.5 is the widest that it goes at the 18mm setting. So I mean widest meaning like the opening of the lens. And f5.6 is the widest or largest it can go when the lens is set at 55mm, just because as you're zooming in, you're losing some light due to the tunneling effect. So basically, you can't use the lens at f3.5 at 55mm, just because, like I said, there's more of a tunneling effect. It doesn't go that wide. Some of the higher-end constant aperture lenses allow you to use the largest aperture throughout the full zoom range. So, for example, like the Nikon 24 to 70 f2.8G. So it's 2.8 all the way through, from 24 all the way through 70. So you're not limited by the focal length chosen, unlike the variable aperture, meaning like 3.5 to 5.6 one. Of course, Canon also has a version 24 to 70 2.8, same thing. So both these lenses allow you to use the f2.8 at the widest and full range, which is nice. I think Sony also makes one. Now the third part of the exposure triangle is the ISO, and that stands for International Standards Organization. And ISO is the variable sensitivity adjustment made to accommodate the incoming light levels exposing the sensor. I know that's kind of like a long-winded way of saying, it's readjusting the gain. I guess it'd be best described as the old school film speeds printed on the box. So like, it used to be called ASA, so that's American Standards Association, to indicate the film sensitivity. So I remember seeing like a box of Kodak 1000 ASA film showing someone by the light of a candle. So because it said 1000, you know that it's more sensitive, let's say ASA 100 or 400. So that's the best way, I guess, to just think of ISO as the different film speeds, but you don't have to physically change the film. All you do is just turn up a dial. So ISO range on a DSLR camera, I would say stay below ISO 2000 just for usable images in most cameras, because anything above that, it starts to get really grainy. So in the old school film days, it would be grain, but in terms of digital, it would be noise. And that's translated basically into like the kind of, it gets very noisy, blotchy, and granulated, heavily pixelated in some cases. So basically, the lower the ISO used equals better image quality in way of sharper images and increased dynamic range, colors, and details rendered. So you want to, if you can get away with it, set your ISO to the lowest that you can get away with. Higher the ISO is used for shooting handheld in low light, allowing you to capture motion at the cost of noise in the way of artifacts and color blotching. So like I said before, sometimes you just can't avoid using a higher ISO. You can take low light images at the lower ISO, but then you'd need a tripod, and anything moving would be blurred, or it won't even show up on the image because it's not, the image isn't there long enough, or the subject isn't staying still long enough to burn through on an image. Various camera exposure modes, so auto or program. Some cameras call it auto, some cameras call it program. It's usually indicated by a green marking on the dial. That camera does everything, including popping up the flash if needed. The P mode, the next one, is basically camera still does most of the work, but it lets you select the ISO and metering pattern. Yeah, so it does most things. I forgot a G there, sorry. The next mode would be S, would be shutter, and you select the shutter speed and the camera selects the corresponding aperture value. So what it does is it tries to keep it equal. So if you select one value, it'll keep it let's see if I can demonstrate that here. Alright, so if I choose, let's say 1/4 of a second here, or 6 or 10, you see the number on the right changes to correspond to that. So basically it's like a scale. If one goes up, the other has to go down until it like reaches that happy medium. So you raise the shutter speed, then the aperture value changes. So of course in A mode is the aperture priority, and that's where you select the aperture and the camera selects the corresponding shutter. It's the same idea there. And then in manual mode, you select both shutter and aperture. And there you can control exactly how you want the image to look without the camera biasing it in any way. So as you can see, I'm dialing down the exposure way dark. The camera's not trying to correct for it, it's letting me do that. So if you want to control freezing or blurring action, select the S or shutter speed mode, shutter priority. If you want to control the amount of sharpness from near to far, or depth of field, select the A or aperture priority mode. Usually a lot of landscape photographers will select the A mode because they can control how much of the image stays sharp from near to far. And if you want total control of both creative effects and not have the camera bias or settings, select the M or manual mode, as I just demonstrated there. So light metering modes. So even then, the way that the camera sees the image, it tries to average everything out to an 18% gray. So if it's too dark, it'll open it up to make it lighter. If it's light, it'll try to go back down. So basically you have matrix metering or matrix or evaluative, and that's pretty much, it reads the whole scene and then kind of averages things out. Center weighted metering, as it implies, it it biases toward the center, so it'll select the center portion to take its reading. And spot metering, it'll take a small spot depending on how big the spot metering sensor is. Now, back in the day, when you're shooting film, camera meter, excuse me, it's not as critical as it is when they're shooting with film. So, because of our post-processing, metering pattern selection is not as critical as film-based. The camera meter attempts to average out the dark and light portions of the scene to an 18% gray, as I mentioned. It doesn't know what white snow should look like, so that's why it sometimes looks gray, and then it doesn't know what black looks like, so sometimes it'll render that light gray. So, and you can also dial in an exposure compensation plus or minus to correct it to your liking if you're in one of those semi-auto modes, I call it. The camera will give you pretty much, pretty right. It'll be pretty right about 90% of the time in the default matrix evaluative wide metering mode, unless you have a really tricky situation like a bright snow or dark night or what have you. But for basic shooting, I think you should be okay. Just leave it at that. But yeah, so there you go, guys. Just a quick overview of exposure. I know I went through a lot of stuff. You can certainly, rewind the video and pause and take a look at some of the screenshots. But as you get used to the camera, shoot it on auto or P, and then once you want to, get more comfortable and expand your photographic, knowledge or what have you, go ahead and experiment with it. And since it's digital, you're not wasting any film, so that's good. All right, guys, thanks for watching, and see you next time.